For the years is if you don't have failure, you can't have success.
Yeah.
Because every time you fail, you learn something.
At 79 years old, Barry Gibb has reached a point where he's finally talking about pieces of his past he kept private for decades. And out of all the people he could mention, the name he's choosing to open up about is the one almost no one expected: Cliff Richard. Fans know Barry as the mastermind behind the Bee Gees, but very few understand how deeply Cliff shaped his earliest musical identity, or how that influence resurfaced at one of the darkest moments of Barry's life. What Barry is revealing now ties together a childhood idol, a broken guitar, a song that sat untouched for years, and a loss that nearly ended his career. And the truth he finally shared about Cliff Richard changes the story more than anyone imagined.
I think that did something to me.
What do you think it did?
Gave me that insight, gave me that instinct about music, about life, about everything.
In November of 2003, just 10 months after Morris Gibb's sudden passing, Barry Gibb walked into a recording studio to work with Cliff Richard. It was not a flashy comeback moment or a big industry event. It was two musicians meeting with a shared purpose, working on two songs for Cliff's new album. One of them being I Cannot Give You My Love, a track Barry had written with his son Ashley back in 2001. What made this session different from anything Barry had done before was the emotional thread connecting it to the past. The original demo from 2001 included Morris's keyboard performance, recorded casually at the time, and never intended to carry such weight later on. But when Barry revisited the song after Morris's death, those keyboard parts suddenly felt priceless.
Is that or because?
No, just makes me emotional.
Yeah, how special they were. You alright?
Yeah.
They were one of the last musical fingerprints Morris had left behind. Instead of replacing them or re-recording the entire track, Barry made the deliberate decision to keep Morris's work in the final version. That meant the 2003 studio session was not just about polishing a new single. It became a small reunion. One last chance for Barry to create something alongside his brother, even if it was through a preserved piece of a demo. Barry handled more than just the songwriting and emotional weight of the project. He produced both tracks, played guitar, and added background vocals next to Cliff Richard's lead. For someone who had spent the majority of his life making music as part of a trio, working without his brothers was unfamiliar territory. But this project gave him a bridge, a way to step forward while still holding on to the sound and presence of Morris. When the song was finally released in 2004, it reached number 13 on the United Kingdom singles chart and became part of Cliff's album Something's Going On, which went gold. Reviews were strong. Music Week even named it Album of the Week. But for Barry, the chart positions and accolades were secondary. What mattered most was that Morris's playing, a small piece of a quiet moment from 2 years earlier, had found a proper, meaningful place.
Now, I understand a lot more. I understand what made them unhappy. They were right.
Why were they right?
Because it was a group.
Yeah.
And we should have all been supporting each other much more than we did. I got too much attention. Robin didn't get enough. And Mo certainly didn't get enough. I never understood their feelings until a couple of years.
Most fans had no idea that the song carried this history. To the public, it was just a solid collaboration between two respected artists. But behind the scenes, it marked a private healing moment for Barry. The completion of something that started long before the Bee Gees were global icons, long before stadium tours, and long before awards stacked up in their homes. Because the connection between Barry Gibb and Cliff Richard didn't begin in a studio. It didn't begin in a writing session or a phone call arranged by managers. It started almost 50 years earlier with a young Barry in Manchester, holding a battered guitar and trying to imitate the voice of the man he'd grown up hearing on the radio. To understand what Cliff Richard meant to Barry Gibb, you really have to rewind to 1957 in Manchester, back when Barry was just 11 years old and the world around him felt a lot smaller. At that point, he had already formed a skiffle group called the Rattlesnakes with his younger brothers Robin and Morris, plus two neighborhood friends, Paul Frost and Kenny Horrocks. They were just kids with big musical dreams, but even then, music was the thing that gave their lives shape. By 1957, the Rattlesnakes had their own routine going. Every Saturday, the Gaumont Cinema held morning shows for kids, and during the break between films, the stage opened up for young performers. Most of those kids would stand there and mime to whatever songs were popular that week. But the Gibb brothers weren't content with pretending. They actually sang live, which immediately made them stand out. The audience didn't expect live singing at a kid's matinee, and yet here were three brothers performing harmonies while everyone else just moved their lips. A big part of their set list came from Cliff Richard. Along with songs by Paul Anka, Buddy Holly, and the Everly Brothers, Cliff's music shaped their early sound. His songs had a mix of confidence and teenage energy that Barry felt drawn to. Their neighbor, Kenny Horrocks, talked about another boy, Brian Lewis, who also sang Cliff Richard covers during those Gaumont intermissions, which shows how deeply Cliff had already made his mark on young British singers. Before the Bee Gees were the Bee Gees, Cliff Richard was part of their musical DNA. Barry has mentioned many times that Cliff was one of his earliest influences. Alongside artists like Tommy Steele, the Mills Brothers, the Everly Brothers, and Paul Anka, Cliff helped shape the musical instincts that Barry and his brothers carried into adulthood. These were not just songs the boys listened to casually. These were songs Barry studied. He learned the phrasing, the vocal moments, the little choices that made a performance stick. These artists set the blueprint for the sound Barry would grow into. There's a small moment from those early days that captures how fragile everything was back then. In 1958, Barry's guitar, the same one he used to play those Cliff songs, was accidentally broken by his friend Paul Frost. The house was completely dark at the time because the family couldn't afford to pay the electricity bill. Paul sat down in the dark and unknowingly crushed the guitar. It was one of those memories that sticks because it shows how uncertain everything was. Music wasn't a glamorous dream. It was a lifeline in a home where nothing came easy. Still, even with obstacles like that, Barry kept pushing. He kept singing those Cliff Richard numbers. He kept practicing. He kept holding on to the idea that music might eventually take him and his brothers somewhere different. Those Gaumont mornings didn't feel like a career yet, but they were the first steps. When most people think of the Bee Gees, their minds automatically go to the falsetto era, the disco wave, the white suits, and the sound that defined an entire decade. Songs like Stayin' Alive and Night Fever became so iconic that it's easy to forget the group had a whole musical life before the 70s. But Barry Gibb has often pointed out that the foundation of the Bee Gees' sound goes back much further, and that Cliff Richard played a real role in shaping it. Before the world ever heard Barry's falsetto, the Gibb brothers were focused on harmonies. They have said many times that their early style came directly from the Everly Brothers, only with a third harmony added. That approach became the heart of songs like New York Mining Disaster 1941, their first major international hit in 1967. But before they were working out Everly-style harmonies, they were singing Cliff Richard songs as kids in Manchester and later in Australia. For Barry, those early musical influences were more than learning melodies or performing covers. They were lessons in how British artists could fit into rock and roll, a genre mostly dominated by Americans at the time. Cliff Richard was the first major clue that a young British singer could break through. He was proof that a British sound wasn't just possible, it could be successful and respected in a field where Elvis Presley and other American artists were the standard. All three Gibb brothers, Barry, Robin, and Morris, saw Cliff as an influence. Morris openly talked about how much Cliff's work shaped his early musical thinking, putting him in the same category as the Everly Brothers, Paul Anka, the Mills Brothers, and the Beatles. And that mattered. These were not distant, unreachable stars from across the ocean. Cliff was British, someone who felt familiar and attainable. If he could rise in the industry, maybe they could too. What Barry absorbed from those years wasn't only about how to sing or what songs to choose. It was about the bigger picture, longevity, reinvention, and how to keep evolving without losing your identity. Cliff Richard began in the late 1950s and kept releasing relevant music for decades, always adjusting to new eras without abandoning who he was. The Bee Gees ended up following a similar path. They shifted from 60s harmonies to 70s disco, from songwriting for themselves to writing for others, all while maintaining a signature style that listeners could still recognize. And that brings everything back to the moment when Barry and Cliff finally worked together. A collaboration that almost didn't happen at all, shaped by timing, personal loss, and a song that had quietly existed for years before the world heard its final version. The story behind how they finally came together is one of those moments where music, memory, and fate suddenly line up in a way nobody could have predicted. And that's where things start to get even more interesting.
And he said, "Oh, I'm so glad you called." He said, "The band and I have been such fans of yours." I went, and then I thought to myself, I bet. Anyway, and then he said to me, "We wrote a song for you once." And I said, "But what do you mean you wrote a song for me? I never got a song." He said, "I know. We didn't know how to get the song to you." So he said, "We recorded it." So I said, "Well, which one was it?" My Love was written by Barry and his son Ashley. And of course, although I was recording in Nashville, I said, "Please, I'll come anywhere. If you want to come to Nashville." He said, "Well, I've got my own studio here in Miami." I said, "I'll come."
In 2001, Barry co-wrote I Cannot Give You My Love with his son, Ashley Gibb. From the start, the song was meant for Cliff Richard. Barry and Morris recorded a demo, with Morris handling the keyboards. For the brothers, this kind of work was familiar territory. Barry had a long history of writing for other artists: Barbra Streisand, Diana Ross, Kenny Rogers, Dolly Parton, and Celine Dion. Creating a song for Cliff wasn't unusual, but it did feel meaningful. Cliff had been one of the voices Barry listened to as a kid, and writing for him all these years later felt like closing a loop that started back in the 1950s. But before the song could move forward, everything changed. On January 12, 2003, Morris Gibb died suddenly from complications of a twisted intestine. He was only 53 years old. For Barry, the loss was not just personal. It was the end of a musical identity that had shaped his entire life. He had been performing with his brothers since childhood. They had built everything together, from the Rattlesnakes to the Bee Gees. Without Morris, nothing felt the same. Naturally, the group stopped performing. The Bee Gees, as the world knew them, were gone. The months that followed were heavy. Barry grieved privately and publicly. Performing was too painful, but he could still write, produce, and help other artists bring music to life. And there was that unfinished song, sitting quietly in the background, holding the last keyboard performance Morris had ever recorded. 10 months after Morris's death, in November 2003, Barry returned to the project. He went into the studio with Cliff Richard and produced 2 tracks, I Cannot Give You My Love and How Many Sleeps. During the process, he made a deliberate decision. He kept Morris's 2001 keyboard parts intact. They were woven directly into the new recordings. It was Barry's way of letting Morris stay part of the music even after he was gone. Not as a tribute or a dramatic gesture, but as a continuation of what they had always done together. The session with Cliff arrived at a time when Barry needed something steady to hold on to. Producing those songs gave him structure and purpose in the middle of his grief. And only a few months later, on May 2nd, 2004, Barry and Robin stood at Buckingham Palace to receive the CBE. Morris's son, Adam, accepted his father's award on his behalf. It was a moment filled with pride and sadness, the kind of moment that shows how intertwined the Bee Gees' personal and musical lives always were. And as Barry continued giving interviews over the years, reflecting on a career that stretched across 7 decades, he became more open about the artists who shaped him in those early days. Cliff Richard's name kept coming up, and the way Barry talked about him revealed something deeper about why their 2004 collaboration mattered so much, not just musically, but personally. And what Barry eventually said about Cliff, after all those years and all those songs, added a layer to their story that most fans never knew existed. As Barry continued reflecting on his 7-decade career, especially in interviews during the 2010s and 2020s, he became more open about the artists who shaped him long before the Bee Gees became a global phenomenon. One name kept resurfacing: Cliff Richard. Not in a nostalgic, "oh yes, he was an influence too" kind of way, but in a steady, genuine acknowledgement that Cliff played a major role in shaping how Barry understood music during his earliest years. Whenever Barry spoke about the Rattlesnakes era, Cliff's name sat right beside the Everly Brothers and Paul Anka, artists whose songs he and his brothers practiced until they could perform them confidently on stage at Saturday morning cinema shows. These were the voices he learned to harmonize with before he ever wrote his first song. Cliff wasn't just a chart topper he admired. He was part of the foundation that helped Barry figure out what he wanted to sound like, how to blend harmony, and how to build a musical identity as a British teenager in a world dominated by American rock and roll. What fans often don't realize is how deeply Barry internalized Cliff's example. Cliff represented something rare in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a British artist who could stand tall in a genre still ruled by American stars. He didn't imitate Elvis Presley. He built his own lane. He adapted over the decades without losing his core style. He kept evolving, yet people always recognized him. For a young Barry, growing up in Manchester and later in Australia, watching Cliff succeed with a British voice and British songwriting showed that it was possible to have staying power without abandoning who you were. So when you fast forward to the early 2004s, when Barry was navigating life after Morris's passing, the timing of the Cliff Richard collaboration becomes even more meaningful. Barry didn't speak about it directly as healing, but the context says enough. Cliff had endured his own waves of public scrutiny, personal challenges, and industry shifts across multiple decades. In a quiet way, Cliff understood the pressure of longevity, the weight of maintaining a legacy while carrying personal grief in the background. And the choice Barry made in 2003, 10 months after Morris died, holds emotional significance that goes beyond the music. He could have shelved the song indefinitely. He could have rewritten it entirely. Instead, he moved forward with the original intention, to finish the song for Cliff. And he preserved Morris's keyboard part, treating it not as a relic, but as an active ingredient in the finished track. It was his way of keeping Morris in the room, not only for his own sake, but also for an artist who had influenced him since he was 11 years old. Barry's later interviews make it clear that Cliff wasn't just a professional collaborator. He was someone Barry quietly looked up to, a reminder of where his love for performance began, and a reminder of how long a music career can stretch when you stay true to what you're good at. And when you look at all these pieces together, it becomes easier to see why Barry chose that moment, in the middle of grief, to bring a Cliff Richard song into the world, and why Morris's keyboard part stayed exactly where it belonged. What Barry finally said about Cliff revealed something personal and long-standing, something that reshapes how fans understand the connection between two of Britain's most enduring musical legends. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden stories behind the legends you thought you already knew, make sure you hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know in the comments which artist's untold story you want next.